Hello, everyone, and good evening, and welcome to another Wandering Scribe author interview. I am your host, Gabriel Garcia, otherwise known as the Wandering Quill and the Wandering Scribe. And my guest today is an award winning author, Army veteran, and astute student of history. In his personal life, my guest is a published author of historical fiction with three novels currently in publication and a fourth slated to hit the shelves May of this year. He also writes articles about East Asian history for magazines such as Military History Quarterly, Medieval World, and many more. Joining us for the first time on the channel, let's give a huge round of applause to author Mr. Marvin Haynes. Marvin, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thanks, Gabriel. I appreciate it.
You're welcome, Marvin. So, is there anything more you'd like to add about your background? Anything little tidbits of information you'd like to add before we dive into your Roman series?
No, as you said, I'm an Army officer. Have been for about almost 30 years now. Graduated from West Point in '94 with a degree in history, and then with a master's from the University of Hawaii in Asian Studies, which has been most of my academic focus, if not necessarily my writing focus to date.
Nice. And speaking of writing, I understand that you've written a Roman series, which earlier today you gave a little bit more information, which instantly had me hooked. Being a classical historian, I absolutely loved. So, for our viewers, what can you tell us about your Roman series of books?
The series is called the Fulvius Chronicles, and it really follows frankly a fairly despicable character from the back streets of
Ooh,
Rome, who finds himself thrust into the legions during a period of crisis for the Republic.
nice, nice. And apologies, little technical errors, viewers. Apologies for that. Apologies, viewers. Slight technical errors. Don't worry. I apologize for this. Normally, this does not happen as frequent, but don't worry, these will be edited out of the final cut. I apologize.
No worries, it's an awful long distance to connect.
Come on. Okay. So, as I was saying before, what was sort of the oh, boy. uh pardon me for 1 second. I'm going to try something really quick just so we have at least a stable connection. Apologies, Marvin, or did I lose you?
No, I've got you.
Perfect. All right. For the viewer, I had to do a quick little technical thing to make sure the connection was stable.
Sure.
Hopefully, it stays like that for the rest of the interview. But don't worry, as I said, this will all be taken out. So, as I
Sure.
was saying before the internet decided to be mean today, so Martin, for you as a student of history, where did sort of the idea of this Roman series of books come about? Was it something that you've always wanted to write about? Were you always a writer growing up, or did that come later in life?
I mean, I've always enjoyed writing. I guess it always was relaxing for me as life went on and difficulties arose. I found over the years that it actually was very relaxing as well. And so the first novel I ever started to write was actually during my time at the Defense Language Institute, learning Japanese, a fairly intense course that was very stressful. And I started writing just as a way to relieve stress. Didn't actually finish that novel, oddly enough. The first one I actually finished was drafted while I was deployed to Afghanistan, 2010. Um,
Wow.
the book Persian Blood was about the war in Afghanistan with a fairly hefty historical fiction backstory. But I just found that it was very relaxing, very calming for me, and that's kind of where writing's been for me ever since. I find it that it really relaxes me and just kind of helps me to tune out all the craziness in the world.
Nice. And I would have to agree. Writing is, I've noticed, like, it is in a way therapeutic. You are able to like escape the realities and just dive into a new world that you're created yourself, or a world that we've already have known for a long time, like the past, but you're now just diving into the past.
Sure.
And now let's explore the Roman series, because I'm really eager to know about the creation behind it. So let's actually peel the layers back. So when you decide to create this series, starting with the first book, what was sort of the need or desire you wanted to satisfy for your future readers?
Yeah, I'll be honest. The first, as I mentioned before, the first book was sort of an accident. I'd never really written anything that was purely historical fiction before. Always wanted to. Had grown up studying Rome even as a kid, um, and so wrote a short story. Wrote a short story that was actually inspired by a podcast by Dan Carlin, his historical podcaster. In it, he asked the question, can you imagine what it would be like to fight an elephant? And that ended up being the heart of the short story. Um, which actually I titled, Seeing the Elephant, which had, several layers of meaning there as well. Didn't actually win the contest, but the folks who proofread the story really liked it and kept bothering me. They kept saying, "Hey, you need to write this character into a book." And I was busy, and it just didn't seem like the time, and until it did, right? I mean, you know how these things happen. All of a sudden, it just
Right.
kind of felt right, and all of a sudden it kind of came together in my mind how I could actually tell this guy's story and place it in the context, the historical context, and in the context of everything that was going on there. And so I can't say that there's any overriding deep philosophical desire behind my writing. I wanted to tell a good story, and that's kind of how I feel with all the books so far. I really just want
Nice.
a story that folks can get engrossed in, get lost in. I want them to close their eyes at night and see Rome. I want them to,
Yes.
and the dirty, the gritty Rome. Not necessarily what ends up in a lot of the movies and is very Hollywoodized. I kind of want them to see Rome full of people, full of Roman
Right.
people living their lives, the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Definitely. And I also like that you're choosing a period in Roman history that not a lot of people really know about, which is, of course, the Second Punic Wars, which, for anyone who knows that part in early Roman Republic history, that was literally the time in Rome's infancy where Rome almost kind of lost to a major superpower, which, of course, were the Carthaginians under Hannibal with his brothers Mago and Hasdrubal. And the Second Punic War is very fascinating to learn about how Hannibal, gathering his allies from Spain, Gaul, crossing the Alps, and fighting the Romans. And it's a very interesting battle, or the battles that take place during the Second Punic War, because I talked with a lot of historians, and I've even done research myself, that if anything went horribly for the Romans, even more so than we have recorded, Rome would have been completely changed. Like, what we know as Romans and Roman history would have been gone. And by sheer luck, the Romans survived. So you may have already said this before, but I'm really interested, especially with this topic when it comes to historical fiction. What is sort of the promise you're making to your readers who pick up a story about Rome? Because, as you said, a lot of people have the idea of like the Roman Empire because it's been
Right.
so talked about, it's been immortalized in pop culture and fiction, but we really don't have a lot of stories that talk about the early history of Rome and the Republic era.
No, 100%. Everybody's image of Rome, really, and not everybody, but most people's the public's image of Rome is that of the empire. It's from Julius Caesar on,
Mm,
and so most people aren't terribly familiar with Rome as a republic and the problems that really started to eat away at that. And I've you know as a historical fiction writer, you're kind of in this weird place where you can't alter anything that really happened, right?
no.
You've got to be true, or else the readers who know are going to tune you out really quick. And
Hmm.
so you kind of have to be as play it as honest as you can with regard to the actual history. That said, as you can imagine, with anything that long ago, there's a lot of gaps in the history, and the gaps are
Right.
just wonderful crevices for the writer of historical fiction to sort of dive in and create really a believable storyline. With this series and telling the story of Fulvius, it kind of branches off from what you said just a few minutes ago. This was a time of crisis for Rome. This was, I
Hmm.
mean, Rome may have been snuffed out at this point, and my story picks up literally right after the catastrophic loss at the Battle of Cannae.
Yes.
Every legion that Rome owned was sent, and they were destroyed. And all of a sudden, Rome panicked. They thought they had no recourse but to enlist slaves and enlist criminals into two new legions that they scrapped together at the last minute. They didn't have equipment for them, so they pulled equipment out of all the temples and people's private collections. And so these guys are just up on the wall with this crazy assortment of gear and try to capture the flavor of that panic and the flavor of these two legions that are just made up with you've got some folks who volunteered, but if they were fit for duty, they would have volunteered sooner, right? So you've got these
Right.
two legions that are just made up of these misfits and these criminals, and the folks in charge of them aren't terribly happy to be in charge of this kind of a legion. And so all of that just sort of comes together, and of course you've got all these criminals, right? In Fulvius's
Right.
case, he was doomed to die. His word comes of the catastrophic loss in the middle of his death sentence being carried out, and so he's granted a reprieve, but it's sort of just another death sentence, right? Okay, everybody's dying with Hannibal. We got these guys are going to die anyway. Let's just send them to the Legion, and so he ends up having to try to find his way. But this is an intensely dishonorable, narcissistic guy who's only ever looked out for himself. And so being thrown into the military, thrown into the Legion, gives him fits in the beginning, until he kind of figures out how to try to make it work in his favor. Um, you asked specifically about a promise to the readers. Um, while I do certainly want to help inform of just the general environment and the history of the Roman Republic. That's sort of background of the story. I want folks to get lost in this story of this guy.
Right.
This guy who's granted he's a horrible human being, but he's doing the best he can, and you can understand that based on how he grew up. I mean, this is a guy who was orphaned, raised in the back streets. He stole for food. I mean, he did what he could to survive, and it's made him this person that society would consider a monster and does consider a monster. And yet now he finds himself in the legions, fighting on behalf of this republic that's never really done him any good.
Definitely. And for viewers, if you may have seen my previous guest appearance on another podcast, and I talked heavily about the battle that Marvin just explained and why that's so significant. Now, sources say like time up how long it took for all those soldiers to die. Some sources say 6 to 7 hours, and keep that in mind, viewers. 6 to 7 hours in a time with no modern day weapons. Is it just swords, clubs, spears, up close and personal? That was at that time the largest defeat Rome had ever gotten in its history, and everything Marvin said is accurate. It's true. Rome was pretty much on like life support, pretty much gathering every able-bodied man they could find to like fight back. Because if Hannibal had pushed on, if he had committed to his goal of conquering Rome and burning it to the ground, Rome and what it is to be a Roman soldier would have been drastically different. And I would imagine, Marvin, that this story is also an exploration into the human experience. Like, what could an ordinary person at this time in Roman history, at its most dire, go through? And as you said, he's not a likable character, he's a detestable character, but he's a very complex individual because whatever you may view him as, he is still a person put in a situation he doesn't want to be there, but we're seeing the world through his eyes and seeing how he views Rome through his perspective, which is very, very fascinating, which I'm very eager to see.
Sure, I've had reviewers say that he's a character that over time you love to hate.
Nice. And that actually kind of leads into the next question, Marvin. So when you published the first book, you had the editor look at it, you found the cover artist, you got everything ready, you did all you need to do, and you put it out there on the digital stage. What was the initial reaction like? Were the reviews positive, negative, mixed? And is there one review that stands out to you?
Um, yeah, I mean the reviews were actually very positive. Again, as an independent author, you don't have a huge distribution, so you take your wins where you can get them. The I guess the best review I ever received, uh, compared the writing to Stephen Pressfield, and
Ooh.
since he is one of my all-time favorite historical fiction writers, I couldn't have imagined a better thing for somebody to say, frankly, about one of the books. I was absolutely thrilled.
And I'm glad you actually mentioned Stephen Pressfield. I've read a lot of his books, and honestly, I think he is probably in the forefront of historical fiction when it comes to Roman history, especially Imperial Roman history. And that is quite a compliment to get. I would imagine upon reading that, that was like, wow, like, thank you for that.
It's okay. I read it 4 or 5 times just to make sure. Yeah, I was pretty thrilled.
Nice. And now, coming into the next question, which is a more personal one, but before you go that, so when you got a review like that and reviews afterwards, did you feel that they validated your promise that you set out to tell a good story, but also to educate people about a period of Roman history that really doesn't get a lot of discussion in popular culture?
Yeah, I think so. I'd like to think so. As I said, this series is really character driven, whereas my first book was really driven by the story, and if anything, Persian Blood was every bit about an ancient artifact as it was about the people who were the central theme of the story. But the Fulvius Chronicles really do center on Fulvius and this group of folks that are closest to him, and so I get the impression reading the reviews and talking to folks afterwards, that they just kind of get lost in the story, and they almost all the background, all the details, and all the stuff that you lovingly pour into to the scenes in the background of a story like this sort of get lost because they're so focused on the story. And again, I'll take that. I mean, that's okay, for the folks who are interested in picking up something about the early, about the Republican period in Rome's history. I think that they get what they're looking for. I hope they get what they're looking for. There's a lot of sources out there to get information on Republican Rome if you're interested. When I went to the second book, which the setting actually it takes place in Illyria. Um,
Ooh.
Things get really different, right? Because there's only like 1 or 2 books in English on Illyria at all, and so the
Mm.
information's really sparse. And again, for an historical fiction writer, it's a playground. You've got this
Right.
massive canvas to mess around with, and that was really a lot of fun. That said, nobody really has anything to compare that to. There's not a lot of books written on the ancient Illyrians um, or 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 with stories taking place on the coast of
Right.
what's modern Croatia. And so you don't see so many comments back because I think folks aren't really sure what to make of it, right? They're not sure
Right.
what's history, what's completely made up, and so the reviews tend to reflect that as well. You see a lot fewer comments about the setting, and again, a lot more focused on the characters in the story.
Definitely. Definitely. And now this kind of leads into a really personal question. So, as I'm sure you know, Marvin, being an independent author, an author in general, when creating a project, especially a passion project, it's a labor of love. It's long hours, writing, editing, and then finding an editor to edit the story, polish it up, and then finding a cover artist to write, or not write, but to create a design that matches the story, and then sending it out there onto the digital stage and, wondering if it's going to resonate with your audience and readers. And in the back of every author's mind, I feel, is that voice of imposter syndrome. Like, what are you doing while you're writing this? Or am I doing this correctly? Or should I even be in this field? And I'm wondering, Marvin, for you, have you ever had those moments of imposter syndrome? And if not, what has disciplined you to continue writing because this is something that you love?
Um, yeah, I've had those moments. They're brief. I'm not terribly given to self-doubt. Uh, Part of it's, I guess, just upbringing. Part of it's, being in the military for 30 years. It's not a good look. And with the writing, like I said, it's it's every bit as much for me as it is for the readers out there. Um, the number of readers is growing, and so I guess that balance is going to swing in their favor here before long. But that said, at this point, I'm telling Fulvius' story for myself. Again, I get so much out of it, um, and so I keep writing because, again, the writing keeps me grounded. It helps me to get past the craziness at work on a given day, or whatever else is going on in the world. I can just immerse myself into this world, from 2,200 years ago. And that kind of blocks everything out because there's, the similarities, sure, people are people. But other than that, there's not a lot of vestiges of ancient Rome when I look out the window of my apartment here in Korea. So it's really easy just to sort of crawl into that setting, and frankly find solace there, and find relaxation and calm there.
Nice. And I 100% agree. It is almost like, in a sense of like, an escape, as we said in the beginning, to travel to a different world, write about it, see the people, and just being amazed by it. And I myself am writing a book about Rome and the Second Punic Wars, and I'll mention that a little bit later. But now we actually turn to the business side of being an author, which I think is really important. So, Marvin, as you said in the beginning, that this series of books started with a short story, and the people who were looking at the short story kept telling you, you got to make this longer, you got to make this into a story. So, when you decide to make this into a story and you finish with the draft and then got to the final draft and then want to publish it, did you want to go the route of an independent publisher, or did you want to try your hand at traditional publishing?
Yeah, I mean that's the question for all writers these days. It was made a little simpler for me just because I'm still in government service. I'm not necessarily completely free to do the things that a traditional publisher would want from an author.
Okay.
So that being the case, but still wanting to get these stories out. That being the case, I went indie pretty easily, with an intent to just kind of build up, a portfolio of published works. And then when I get to the point where I'm retired, which is not too far away, um, we'll look into other options. Oddly enough, I guess you'd asked in one of your questions, that you sent me online, whether I consider myself an indie author, a traditional author, or a hybrid. I'm not really sure what a hybrid author is, although if anything, I may be heading that way. I've always felt that for a historical fiction writer to be taken seriously, they have to spend some time writing history as well.
Right.
The magazine articles you talked about in the intro are all sort of my way to do that, and to build that base and to build that credibility. That's all led to an opportunity that just was too good to turn down. And so I'm actually working on a project now that's a pure history book for a traditional
Ooh.
publisher. It just sort of fell into my lap, and the draft will be due, well after my retirement date. So all those complications are gone, and I'm kind of hoping that this will open up other doors here in the future. But
Nice.
you mentioned before about finding an editor and all those things. I will say I was very lucky when it came to that. I spent first 5 years after I finished the draft of Persian Blood, trying to edit on my own, and it just became a cycle of frustration. When I finally started looking for somebody to edit that book professionally, I didn't know what to look for. I didn't know what I was doing, and so I just went out and found somebody, and that was a horrible mistake, and
Mm.
it was a horrible experience. And this was a book that's predominantly modern military terminology, and I had to stop and explain everything to this guy, and I'm like, okay,
Oh, okay.
this is probably not the guy who should be editing this book. And so with that negative experience, then I went out and did a whole bunch more research, and ended up finding somebody who not only had a history of editing historical fiction works, but also modern military stories too. I'm like, okay, this sounds perfect. Reached out to him. He asked me to send the work, and he took the project on, and he's edited every book I've done since. Absolutely love the guy. He's just done great work for me, and so I'll stick with him as long as he'll have me. It's been a great relationship. He's not afraid to call me out when I'm not acting right, but it's been a great partnership, and I really enjoyed working with him.
I 100% agree. And I have the exact same relationship with my editor, who fellow author. Shout out to Lori Ball. She's edited 2 of my books. And yeah, she is very critical. She will tell me, this is awful. This is not good. This needs to be changed. And I trust her judgment completely, because she has given me 8 to 16 pages of edits, 3 rounds of edits, and honestly, I've been a better writer because of it. And she labels everything from developmental edits. Does this fit the narrative? Does this fit the plot? Do the characters resonate? Do the characters change? She is very detailed, and I'm happy to have her, because as you said, that you have to work with this gentleman who's worked on your books, and that connection is very, very important to really hone your book into the audience that you want, which then leads into the another side of the business, which is knowing your audience. So for you, Marvin, as you said before, to be like an historical fiction writer, you have to understand history, which is important to do the research to make sure everything flows correctly. Now, how important would you say, in your opinion, is to understand the audience of the historical fiction genre? Because you can either target the broad historical fiction audience, or you can try to narrow in on the Roman genre, which I must say, in my opinion at least, I think that's probably like the one historical fiction genre that dominates that field. I mean, yes, you have maybe colonial era, you may have medieval, you may get Greek, but very few times have I seen a historical fiction section that's not dominated by Roman history. Either it's Imperial Rome, late Rome, or it's Valerio Manfredi's book, The Last Legion, which is an amazing book. So, in your opinion, Marvin, how important is it for an author to really understand their audience, especially in the historical fiction genre?
Yeah, I think it's really important, right? Because you're connecting with a group of folks who sometimes have a really, very narrowly defined niche interest, and you're either hitting that or you're not. I've my audience has shifted. I've noticed, and I'm trying to, you try to keep up with that. You try to keep ahead of that a little bit. Whereas I began writing, I think, for an audience that was really only interested in Roman historical fiction. I think what I found with the release of the second book, I'm attracted more folks who are interested in crime fiction, strangely enough,
Really?
than just that narrowly historical fiction, and that's been interesting to me. I didn't ever really conceive of this that way, but one reviewer had said something like something along the lines of this is the Godfather set in Rome. I mean, it was it has that kind of a mafia, stabbing everybody in the back, ultimate paranoia kind of feel to it. Because again, that's the world that these characters are in. I mean, these guys are these guys are hanging out in the back streets. They're looking for every way to cheat one another and whatnot. And so it's been interesting watching the comments that come back from the books, because they are shifting. They are shifting from a focus on the historical fiction piece to elements that could only be called, crime fiction. And so I'm trying real hard to stay ahead of that, and trying to make sure I meet that the desire that they have as well, without betraying the historical piece too, because again, those are the folks that I originally set out to write for.
Nice. 100% agree. And that kind of leads to the follow-up question to that, which is, and you probably may already answered here, it's like, how well do you know your readership from the rest of the books in the series, as opposed to when you published the first book in your Roman series?
Yeah, much better now. I like I said, that the first time I sort of backed into it. It hadn't really intended to be a book. It wasn't a series. It was a standalone book, and folks really liked it. And so again, just like sort of getting pushed from the short story version into a full length book. I was kind of happy at the time to just say, okay, that's I did it. Let me move on. Um, but it was one of those things where, okay, these things take on a life of their own a little bit. And again, as an independent author, you can't really afford to tee off your small following that you have, right? I mean, you got these
Right.
folks who are willing to engage with you, willing to read the books, willing to give you feedback. You can't exactly let them down. And so that kind of drove me into writing the second book. And by then I was having conversations with the editor, and he's like, okay, if you're going to do two, this has to be going somewhere, right? And so we talked through a little bit, and he really liked how the second book played out, where where this became really complicated for us. All of a sudden was going into, it was going to be a 3-book series. But because of where the story was going, the amount of exposition that was going to be required to lay out the background of what happened to Marcus, who is Fulvius's only friend, really, the guy he betrays in the very beginning of the first book. You kind of have to lay out his story for this to come to its logical conclusion. And we went back and forth for months before coming up with a way to get at this. And so book 3 is the actually doesn't focus on Fulvius. It tells the story of what happened to Marcus during all that time of Fulvius's
Okay.
first two, because you just have to. There was no way my editor was going to put up with that lengthy exposition in the beginning of the final book in the series, and so just like that, it became a 4-book series. That said, Marcus's story turns out to be pretty crazy, and again, was it just a blast to write. Allowed me to really lay out a lot more of what was going on during the Second Punic War. It kind of places them right in the middle of everything, crossing lines between the Romans and the Carthaginians, and trying to work
Right.
out side deals in the chaos and the complete lack of order that exists in that no man's land. And these guys, Marcus finds a niche, and being who he is, exploits it. And it's a lot of fun. But the whole time, I mean, he's the one that was betrayed in the very beginning. He's the guy that Fulvius kind of screwed in the first book. And so always in the back of his mind, he's living for revenge, living for vengeance. And as he progresses, and as he gets further and further away from the craziness that initial betrayal brought into his life, that becomes possible. Vengeance starts to become possible. And so you start to see the tie-ins, and it was a lot of fun introducing some of the characters who are so important in the second book. You see them a little bit back in time now with this book, and where they're introduced, and it gives you the why of why they behaved the way they did in the second book, which is, like I said, it was a lot of fun, constructing sort of in backwards way, the backstory of these guys who were such important characters in the second book.
Wow. Man, oh man. Now I have to read this book now more than ever, because I just love the world building that you've just told me. Just like Rome literally on its knees, that we talked about in the beginning, how this is a dark period. I mean, 215 BC, that's like right after the Second Punic Wars, and Rome's literally trying to recover from that and just seeing how the people are reacting. And I would imagine um, crafting the story from a short story to a series of novels have taken like a lot of, as we said, time and dedication. But I also think research in terms of not just historical accuracy, but also how do you tell a good story without sacrificing history or not having history take full center stage of the story. So I was wondering, Marvin, what books would you say have really helped you develop your authorial voice in terms of like character development, world building, narrative structure, and just everything? Again, I know you mentioned, of course, that Stephen Pressfield from the review that one person gave in terms of like the comparison. Are there any other authors you would like to name that have really helped you come into your own as an author?
Yeah, I'll start with Stephen Pressfield. I mean, Gates of Fire might be one of my favorite books of all time, and I've read that 3 times all the way through. I absolutely love it, um, and because I love how how he kind of deals with things in a large context, but zooms into the actual action and what I and actually a lot of authors I know don't really enjoy writing action. I love it. I love
Mm.
the chaos that is that was these melees, and folks are
Yes.
fighting and you're losing track of your opponent. And, oh, somebody else is coming at you. It's just this craziness it's almost impossible for us to imagine now. And I want to give a sense of that. When I go back and look at the authors I read as a kid, and I read a lot as a kid. Tom Clancy was probably the biggest influence on me growing up, just for the way he laid out a story. And so I grew up reading Tom Clancy. I grew up reading Robert Ludlum. My
Oh,
father was
okay.
a huge fan of both, and so we had tons of those books laying around the house. And again, as a kid, that's what I read. James Clavell's Shogun, another favorite, historic work of historic fiction, historical fiction. As a teenager, I read that paperback until the cover literally fell apart in my hands. I read it through so many times. Just absolutely loved the work. But yeah, those are, I mean, those are the folks that stick out in my mind as favorite writers. And I mean, for a while, there's nothing Clancy would write that I wouldn't read. I mean, I was just, during that age, and again, growing up, my father was in the military as well, so I grew up in that environment, and that was just what I was comfortable reading and absorbing, and loved the stories. Had been to a lot of the places that are in these books. It was just, it was almost personal.
I have to agree. Steam Pressfield has been a big inspiration for me. The melee battles, I try to emulate that. I love writing battle scenes. I love big battle scenes between large armies. I love writing that. Steven Pressfield has been a huge influence for me. Valerio Manfredi has been another big influence for me, from Spartan, and of course his novel, The Last Legion, which was then later adapted into a film. And then I have a whole bunch of other books. Well, actually, a majority of them are all Stephen Pressfield. Like, and I look at that, they're all Roman. Simon Scarrow is another author I would definitely say has been a big help for me. Alan Smale for his Clash of Eagles series, which, for those who don't know, is probably, in my opinion, the best Roman alternative fiction out there on the market. The best way to describe it is, imagine a world where Rome never fell. It's in the what we would consider the high or early to high medieval age, and they invade North America, or is it called Nova Hesperia, and they meet the Cahokians of Cahokia, and that whole trilogy, it's just so good. That has been a big influence on my writing, and I can definitely see, Mark, like you and I have like shared like very similar authors, and it really does help craft our own story. But then I think kind of leads into another serious topic, which is writing for trends. And I've talked a lot about this with authors on the show about, what is this right for trends, for clicks. Now, in the book world, there's a lot of clicks. There's a lot of things that are on the market, like science fiction, romance, fantasy are usually the big genres that usually get a lot of these subgenres, a lot of clicks that people try to tap into the market. For historical fiction, from what I've seen, it's usually what's happening in the media, like a documentary, a film, or something that's very popular, and everyone tries to join in on the bandwagon to try to write for that market. And sometimes it's a hit or miss depending on if you can write on time. But a lot of others are giving their thoughts on this other side, which is it's not usually your best work because it's not your authentic you.
Right.
You've sacrificed the historical integrity of your writing style, your story, in favor of trying to grab a market. And if you can do it successfully, you can. But you have to be mindful. So, Martin, for you, have you ever come across that in your writing, or have people ever told you, saying you should write for this historical theme because it's all the rage, or this movie's coming out, you should join in on that hype train?
No, I can't say that I have. Nobody's really urged me to go that route. I I mean the topics are right on it because I want to write about them. It's hard for me to see. It's hard for me to see myself going that way. Frankly, it's hard for me to see myself going, diving into some trend just because it's a trend. I think it would be very hard for me to motivate myself to write if it was something I just didn't really feel like I wanted to tell the story.
Right.
And like I said, this Fulvius story has taken on a life of its own, and I kind of enjoy it now. I've spent so many hours between writing and editing. I see these scenes in my sleep now. I mean, it's a welcome thing, right? These are horrible scenes, but they're not nightmares. They're very welcome to me now. These are just I, I guess because I write for myself more than anything else at this point. I write about what I want to write about, and the series that I intend to do upon retirement is about a 9-book series on the historical fiction work on the Japanese invasions of Korea, 1592, where every main character of every book is looking at it from a slightly different point of view, and each additional main character is introduced somewhere early in the book, so there's a continuity, and that's a I see that as being about a 5-6 year project, but it's something I really want to write about and I really want to draw attention to. And just like with the Roman Republic, there's not a lot known in the West about that
No.
conflict. But these are the things that I want to write about, and I can't say that I'm terribly bothered by or maybe even aware of those kind of trends that would put pressure on folks to sort of swing towards I don't want to say a more commercialist approach because that's not necessarily fair, but towards writing things that an author doesn't really feel they want to write about.
100% agrees. And I definitely feel you would definitely say that when you're writing these books. Well, actually, let me ask you this. When you've been writing your Roman series, would you say that you've been writing these books in the sense that these are books that you wished you had growing up, or you are writing these books because you feel that there are other people who would enjoy it?
I that's a tough question. I mean, I want to say yes. both, both are true. These are things that I think I would have really enjoyed reading, growing up, and that I think other people, would enjoy as well. I don't think I'm that unique in my desire to read a good story that I'm leaning in some direction other people wouldn't necessarily want to. Like I said, I think the stories are they're just fun, and I think you should enjoy reading a book. I'll be honest, Persian Blood, little darker, but then again, it was about the war in Afghanistan. It was a little darker, and so the Roman stuff. There's because it's so focused on the main character. You start to appreciate the cheekiness of this guy and the things that he says. You're like, yeah, that's classic Fulvius. You're talking about this guy, right? This guy that's doing these horrible things, but at a certain point, you start to. I don't want to say you start to sympathize with him, although at times the reader should, right?
Right.
And the way they're written, and I kind of want the reader to go back and forth, yeah, this chapter I really, yeah, I understand. I'm behind why he did that. Next chapter, oh God, what a horrible guy, and then 3 chapters later, yeah, yeah, that's exactly right, and kind of want the reader to swing back and forth between those emotions, so that by the time they get done, they're really not sure, whether they like or hate this character.
And I think that's like the telling of like a master storyteller when they can make a character that you don't want to sympathize with, but you can understand where he's coming from. He's a very complex figure, which I think is very fascinating to really explore. And just as a little off tangent, I'm really excited that you mentioned that you're writing a book on the Japanese invasion of Korea in the 1590s, because I myself am writing a book about the Japanese invasions of Korea into from the 1590s into like the early 1600s, and it follows a character that I've created who his story is really interesting. I don't want to give too much spoilers, but he meets a lot of historical figures and lesser known figures. One of which is Yasuke, the African samurai that was brought over by the Jesuits, who later becomes one of his closest allies. In addition to his team, which, to give a little teaser, consists of a French mercenary who was an Ottoman janissary, a Dutch pirate, a Chinese Shaolin monk who fled Ming China, his brother, who's a Ming admiral in the Navy, a shinobi of the Iga clan, a one-armed samurai from the Takeda clan, and you have, of course, Yasuke, and then you have Muhammad, who is a headhunter from the Philippines who worked as an assassin by the Jesuits. And this whole team was literally my own homage to like the stories we had, like a small team of mixed match individuals that come together and work together. And the whole story, which is entitled The Failed Quest, is the war in Japan and into Korea through his eyes as a young boy of 16 years or even 12 years old, all the way to him being an old man in like
Sure.
the 1600s. And really excited to see that. And I'm really eager to see your take and your research on the Japanese invasion of Korea. I'm very excited to see that.
Mhm.
And which kind of leads into another discussion, which I'm really eager to hear your thoughts on, Marvin. So, a while ago, for context for this question, I had a guest a year ago. Her name was Natalie Wright, who is the author of Season of the Dragon. When we talked, I learned that that was her seventh book, not her first. And she dropped a pearl of wisdom that I think a lot of new indie authors should really take to heart, or even traditionally published authors should take to heart, which is there's no guarantee that your debut book's going to be the start of your legacy. It's going to be an overnight success. Now, I've met authors who are exception to that rule. One author, Andy Peliquin, his debut series launched him into award-winning status and allowed him to live off the royalties of that series to create the next three series that he's been working on. But on the offside, you have those who rise, then fall, rise, and then fall completely, and then that imposter syndrome comes back. And that all ties to what I've been learning from a lot of authors who I've been having for this month is the long-term goals of being an author. Are you writing solely for commercial value to live off your royalties, or are you writing solely just to write because it is your passion? Because those are two very different goals.
Right.
So, for you, Marvin, in your own opinion, what is your thoughts on this sort of discussion that there is no guarantee that your book's going to be an overnight success, but that should not deter you from writing if writing is truly indeed your passion?
Yeah, I'm not a huge believer in overnight success. I consider what I'm doing right now to be building a foundation. I'm laying a foundation. I'm building a loyal group of readers, and trying to connect with them. And if someday the royalties are significant enough that it's that I can that they make a dent in the taxes, then that's nice. I'll be honest. I mean, right now, I make much more from the magazine, articles, whatnot, than from the books themselves. Matter of fact, I use I use what I make from the magazine articles to pay for the editing for the books. Frankly, it's just kind of how it's kind of worked out that way for us. But uh, but no, I don't. I guess I don't necessarily dream of being an international bestseller or anything crazy like that. I like telling the stories. I enjoy telling the stories, and I feel like I've got all these stories in my head, and I feel better when I get them down on paper. Okay, that's one less floating around in there. Okay, let's move on to the next one. And so I mean, while there's certainly a commercial aspect to it, there has to be because there's money involved in buying, selling books. Um, Certainly at this point, I'm not looking for any of these books to be an overnight breakout, viral success. I'm just telling. I hope I'm just telling good stories.
Nice. And I think at the end of the day, that's what every author wants to do, just tell good stories. And now arriving to like the final three questions of the interview, Marvin, I'm going to combine the last two together into a two-parter. So for you, Marvin, looking back on your journey as an author and a writer, who would you say have been your biggest supporters on this journey with you? And have you ever gotten a sense of validation from fellow independent authors that you've met and you've shared them your story?
Um, Actually, yeah, I've had contact with quite a few. Oddly enough, very few in my own genre. The only one that I've had significant interaction with, Miranda Armstead, is writing well, what's going to be her first historical fiction work, but it's based on the actual experiences of her family in World War II and the Cold
Ooh.
War. Endlessly fascinating. I can't wait for it to get out. But so a lot of interaction with her, a lot of back and forth with her. A lot of other authors, and they're all independent that I've worked with, have written, on just a whole wide range of genres. Benefcia Varel wrote a book, Military and Mindful. Known her for a long time, her and her husband. Mark Haig has done translations of Japanese martial arts books. Uh,
Ooh.
Known him for quite a while as well. And matter of fact, he's out of all of us, he started writing earliest, and so a lot of the lessons that he learned early on doing things in the indie world, I took and directly applied to what I was trying to do. And then Dr. Michael Bozak wrote a phenomenal book on negotiation, on the art of negotiation, but between nations. I've known Dr. Bozak for a very long time, and given the nature of given Marcus's nature and how he shows up in this book, there are actually a lot of negotiation scenes in this book. And so I actually shared those with Dr. Bozak. Say, hey, does this make sense? Does this follow logically what they're trying to do to each other, how they're maneuvering, and took a lot of points from this guy who's he's considered an expert in that field. But these are all folks that have contributed and frankly have supported me throughout my journey, pretty consistently.
Nice. That's awesome. I think that's actually really important for authors to connect, especially indie authors, to make connection, build each other up because we want to help each other. We want to build upon each other's success. And at the end of the day, as one of my guests said, it's not what you know, it's who you know, and you never know who's going to connect you with someone for research, someone for marketing, someone who has a big following. And honestly, having those people is just incredible. And I've been very fortunate similarly to have a lot of people who have helped me in my growth as an author, and especially as a student of history. And I will always be thankful for that. And that kind of leads into the final question, Marvin, of this amazing interview, which is with everything that you've learned as an author, as a writer, what is your word of wisdom to fellow indie authors who want to get into this field? And as a bonus, a word of wisdom to those who want to go into the historical fiction genre.
For writers in general, if you enjoy it, if it's your passion, do it. Don't worry about what anybody else is saying. Don't worry about, whether somebody's saying you're not doing it right. Just do it. Just write and enjoy it and live in the moment. You'll learn your lessons going forward, to make your work better. And again, if, as we talked about before, if you're careful in choosing your editor, you're going to have a partner that's going to help develop you anyway. So in the meantime, just write, develop your voice, develop, your way of telling a story. With historical fiction, we've kind of touched on this already, but yeah, make the history parts right. Spend the time, do the research. It's agonizing at times. I
Yes.
I met another writer. I wish I could remember his name. It was a God, it was a strange genre, like horror science fiction or something I'd never heard of at the time. But the guy asked me, so, "Oh, what do you write?" And I told him historical fiction. And he goes, "Oh, I'm sorry." I said, "What do you mean?" He says, "Well," he said, "that's a lot of work." He says, if I
Well,
need,
not wrong.
yeah, he's not. But he says, yeah, if I need to know how some weapon I just make it up, and I don't have to spend a lot of time looking things up. And I was like, okay, yeah, he's not wrong. But again, as a student of history, I kind of like the crazy research.
Yes.
For this book, for this third book in a series, Q Fulvius, I Called You Brother. I mean, I found myself looking up the craziest things. Are there crickets on the island of Corsica? I mean, things like that. I mean, just bizarre things. What marks do wild boars leave on trees? I mean,
Right.
crazy things. What types of grass grow in certain parts of Italy? I mean, it was a lot of fun, and I enjoy that. And part of what takes so long, in addition to writing while having a full-time job, part of what takes so long is if you really enjoy the history, you can get lost sometimes in the research.
Definitely.
You'll have spent you were supposed to look up something in 20-30 minutes, and instead you realize the whole day passed as you dove down one rabbit hole after another. It
Same.
happens to us all, right? Um,
Yes.
but it's worth it, and I think it's what makes the settings, really feel authentic and feel real for the reader, because they can tell, when you've got the details right, and they can sense that it's just kind of, you're providing a story that's not just plausible, but could have happened, right? And
Right.
so for historical fiction, I think that's the biggest thing I would say is just don't skimp on the research, dude. Spend the time.
Absolutely. 100%. I cannot agree more. And now we've arrived at the end of this incredible interview. Marvin, thank you so much for coming on the show and telling us about your Roman series. Where can people find and engage with you on social media, and where can they purchase your copies of your book?
Yeah, I've got a proof copy here. It's Q Fulvius.
Ooh,
I Called You Brother. Right now, you can get it on Amazon, ebook, paperback, or hardcover. But Amazon.com, as of about 3 days ago, has opened the sales on that, and it's selling pretty well so far. So really happy with how that's rolled out. But you can get the whole series there, as well as the first book, Persian Blood. But yeah, certainly. And if you're interested in other things that I'm writing and other things I'm doing, www.mghaynes, all one word, .net, is my homepage. A lot of folks actually go there for the pictures. I've got a huge photo galleries from Japan and Korea. I love historical sites, and so can't stop taking pictures and writing about them. But certainly, any of your viewers out there are certainly welcome to stop by.
I will link all those down below in the description of this video. Thank you, viewers and listeners, for coming to us for a late night author interview here on the channel. Again, thank you, Marvin, for coming on the show. It was great talking with you, and I wish you the best success going forward as an author. And who knows, I may have you back on the show again to talk about Japanese book, and we can compare.
Th- Thanks, Gabriel. I really appreciate the opportunity.
You're welcome. Until next time, viewers, it's been the Wandering Scribe and the Wandering Quill signing out, make sure to like and subscribe and comment down below. And until next time, have a wonderful evening.